I had a near-death experience there, and that suddenly just turned my life into complete chaos because nothing made sense anymore. When I was in that state, because mind didn't exist, neither did experience. So the only way I can describe it is
Yo, Cosmic Bridge listeners, welcome back to the show today. And we have on Dr. Kaushik Ram, who joins us all the way from Australia. Now, he's a fascinating guy, so I'm really excited for today's show because I've just spent the last hour researching a lot of his work. He's been dedicating himself to what he's been doing for the last 2 decades, looking at things like what causes a lot of things that are very rife in today's society: depression, anxiety, fatigue, and overwhelm. But he comes at it from a neuroscience background. So we're not going to be like doing hippy dippy stuff today on the show. This is going to be backed up by real data and real science. Let's get into the show. So, Kaushik, I'm really excited for today's show. I've been reading some of your articles before today. I'm not a scientist myself. A lot of our audience is not scientists here, so you'll have to forgive me as I'll probably try and simplify a lot of your language. Although what I do like about what you're doing is it's very different to what a lot of other neuroscientists are doing. What I'd like to do to start today's show is kind of go back to your early life and discuss how did you end up getting into this field you're in at the moment.
yeah, great question. And thanks for having me, Mike. It's wonderful to be here. The origin story for me didn't start with neuroscience. So I was pretty clueless what I wanted to do in my high school years. And when I did get into a university, I pretty much followed the path of other students rather than my own, and didn't like that, and eventually started doing what I had interests in, which was nature. And so I studied biology, animal behavior, zoology, conservation, things like that. So that meant doing a lot of field trips out in country, out in forest. And that, for me, was the direction that I was going in. The first job I ever applied for was for National Geographic. And although I didn't get anything back, if I hadn't been a neuroscientist, that would have been my dream job. And uh, along those lines, I was also exploring nature quite a bit. And on one of my expeditions, I ended up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and I had a near-death experience there. And that certainly just turned my life into complete chaos because nothing made sense anymore. And I had to figure out what had happened to me because at that time I had a girlfriend, and when I came back from Papua New Guinea and I was telling her about the near-death experience, uh, at one point she said, "If you don't stop talking about this, I'm going to leave you." And because I just couldn't stop talking about it. And so she left me and I stopped talking about it. And the only time I did start talking about it was when I had a very clear understanding that wasn't coming from just the experience itself, but from a much more integrated way of thinking. It's not purely scientific, it's not purely spiritual, it's not purely experiential, but over time I've integrated the experience from both science and all the books that I read along the way on spirituality. So that's the reason why I got into neuroscience. It was to reverse engineer an explanation for what had happened to me.
Oh, cool. So yeah, you mentioned this trip to Papua New Guinea and a near-death experience. Tell us more about that.
I mean, the trip itself was never meant to arrive in Papua New Guinea. I basically had booked the cheapest flight out of Australia, where I live, and it happened to be to Bali, which is in the Indonesian archipelago. And so when I arrived there, coming from before I was in Australia, I was in New Zealand, and I was living in a very remote fishing village, which had a population of 150.
Wow.
So coming from that small town, environment to suddenly being in Bali where there was so many people rushing around, that was a bit of a mental overstimulation for me. So I started island hopping all the way east through Irian Jaya, Lombok, and Komodo Island, and all the way east until I reached the western side of Papua New Guinea, which is called Irian Jaya. And then I looked into the mountains and I was like, how do I get up there into the highlands? And so I had to surrender my passport to the Papua New Guinea military, and they took me on a military aircraft with no doors. And basically the plane landed in a grass field, didn't stop, the soldiers jumped out. They're all armed with AK-47s and just some random Indian dude. And I just jumped out of the plane with them, and the plane took off, and the military basically disappeared into the forest, and I was left there with no plane and no support. And the instructions I had received was to go through the clearing in the forest, and you'll arrive at a village, and in the village there would be a something resembling a small hut, which is a pub. Go in there and you'll find a guide. So I went through the forest, found this clearing where there were huts, and went to the biggest hut that was there, and it actually did happen to be a pub. And I found there was only one man sitting there, and was drinking his life away. And yeah, like he happened to be my tour guide. So he basically took me on this survival expedition because I was completely reliant on him for food, for water, for everything. And so we tracked our way through forest. And eventually, at one stage on the way back to the original clearing where the plane landed, we stopped over at a missionary chateau, which had been abandoned for many, many years. And he said I could stay in there because it had a bed, a functioning bathroom. And so when I got into this chateau, which was fortified, I just had the most, I guess, chilling feeling, because I felt like there could have been massacres and headhunting and things like that in there. I just didn't feel right. I was very young at that time. I was only 22, and I had no experience of, anything outside just modern culture. And this chateau just felt really weird. And that night when I slept there, I got incredibly sick, whether it was spirits in the room or something I drank in the water. I don't know what it was. But at that point, I realized this could be my last night. And I wrote a letter to my parents saying I might not make it through the night. And sorry for being young and foolish and just going on random adventures. And at that point, I basically surrendered my life to death, knowing that I might not make it through the night. And my only, I guess, relief was I had already learned to meditate at the age of 19. So I started going deeper into meditation. And through, I guess, culture as well, there's various cultures out there who have voluntary deaths. There's Nordic cultures which have dolmens where people go into voluntary death chambers. In Buddhism, there's Shokushinbatsu, where the monks train for 20 years to die, basically. So I was aware of all of these things. And for me, that would be my, I guess, relief, because I knew I wouldn't be making it through the night. So the actual experience itself, I think that could be a podcast in itself, so I won't get into it. But when I came out of that experience, the first thing that happened to me was my mind suddenly snapped back into reality, because I was in a state of no mind. And so as the mind appeared from when it was vanished, it started to reconstruct reality, and I could actually feel this happening, and I could feel history reconstructing in my mind, and sense of self and all these things. And I couldn't make sense of it. And any question that would appear in my mind, the answer would arrive before that, because I was in this state of no mind where everything was all knowing. And so by the time my mind constructed a question, the answer was already there. And so there's so many things that just completely bewildered me about this state. But because of my cultural history, I also know this to be a state of God. And so at that point, I had no doubt, fear, or any question left in my mind that something other than there's something beyond our own mind. And so that was that experience, and it took me another 5 years to reintegrate back into society. So my girlfriend at the time left me, and I had to go on this journey of like, how do I make sense of this? And so instead of going down the spiritual route, I went down the science route, because I didn't want to appear stupid and just nonsensical.
So that near-death experience, was that what kind of time period was that? Was that just overnight this was all happening to you, or like what kind of time period are we talking about?
I would say it's overnight, but you got to realize that in the state I was in, there was no time, there was no space, there was no orientation. Like for me, there was no sense of time. The material world, yes, sure, time passed, but where I was, there was no sense of it.
Maybe we can go to one of, because I was reading one of your articles before, which was very interesting, around like time dilation, and you were talking about how the mind is always thinking about time, but the body doesn't think about time, and then there's that disconnection between the mind and the body, which I know is one of your passions and one of the things you've done research on. And forgive me if I've misunderstood any of that, but is that passion and that research, is that some of that related to that experience you had in the jungle in Papua New Guinea?
That's a very interesting and actually quite an articulate question. So let's break that question down into pieces. So the experience, once I had it, like any experience, it doesn't leave you. And so that experience of no mind, no dimensions, like that stayed with me, and it stays with me to this day. The practices that I've developed about brain and body, those are, I guess, the shortcuts to that state. And that's the part which I've reverse engineered for people to attain, because I very quickly in my career realized that if I try to explain these things to people, they won't get it. I mean, because I'm coming from a place where mind doesn't exist, while they want to understand it with the mind. And so there's a critical disconnect. So instead of explaining these things to people, I started engineering ways for them to experience it. And when they experience it, then they don't need an explanation. And so that became the way I started teaching how to attain this state. And of course, many cultures throughout the world have done that too, through meditation, through yoga practices, through dance, through transcendence of a performance, when a violinist is just in that moment where people get a glimpse of what it's like to be truly free. So those were the moments that I started to help people attain, but not through any practice, but through ways in which the body instinctively does that. And that became the, I guess, one of the pillars of my research.
Well, okay, maybe we'll come back to that topic of time dilation later. I wanted to ask just last thing on the night in Papua New Guinea. So when you were having that, experience, as you said, where you surrendered to death, and then you said you came back and you were slowly like understanding the world again and like your ego and your sense of self. In the period where you kind of lost your sense of self, did you feel like you were in another world where you were like on the transition to like, the underworld or afterlife or whatever it is when you died? Did you feel like you were like going through some type of journey, or how did it feel in that scenario? Or is it one of those things you can only feel, you can't kind of think about?
So what you described, reconstructing history, time, all of that happened on the journey back to reality. So when my mind snapped back, when I was in that state, because mind didn't exist, neither did experience. So the only way I can describe it is absolute nothing. No light, no darkness, no reference point of any kind. It's just a complete void. It's like the black hole has been sucked out of existence, and so nothing exists. That's the state I was in. And it's so vast that galaxies colliding against each other would appear as like a drop in that universe.
Wow.
I just can't really comprehend the vastness of it.
Okay, so then the world came a little bit back to normal. Obviously, you had this life-changing experience. You mentioned you broke up with your girlfriend because she, I guess, didn't understand and didn't want to talk about what you were talking about. How about was it difficult to talk with other people about it? Were there some people that understood what you went through, or did you feel like a little bit isolated after you've been through that experience?
Yeah, so the isolation is a thing that I deal on a constant basis. I still feel isolated because every interaction you have in the modern world is interacting with people's minds. So that's something that I've had to gain mastery over. How do I relate to humans? It's and that requires its own skill set, of course. I became a public speaker and all of those things. So communication has been something that I developed professionally. But it's one of those things where I don't expect anyone to understand. And after my girlfriend left me, I did stop speaking about it because I didn't see any point speaking about it. It means nothing to anyone. It was the most profound experience in my life, but why should it matter to anyone else? It adds nothing to their life unless they are on the path to become a monk. Then it might have some meaning. But like for the average person, these things are completely irrelevant. And there are things that are actually relevant, which is things like mental health problems, people being disconnected from their bodies, and that leading to various forms of ailments, obesity, diabetes, so on. So being in medicine, being a neuroscientist provided me with practical things that I could help humanity with. And luckily, the experience I had in Papua New Guinea always informed the science instead of so this is the crucial difference. A lot of what I've created as methods and techniques that I teach people has come from that state, and that state has catalyzed the science for me to be able to teach this to people.
You mentioned the link between, well, something that can be tangible is mental health. Obviously, that's a big struggle, I think, especially in the modern world with social media and all these, sensory things we have on a daily basis. And yeah, as we talked about earlier, a lot of your work's dedicated to like that brain and mind and body connection. So yeah, could you talk us through why you think that's so important, and perhaps some of your work on this topic as well?
Yeah, so my work largely comes from frustration with the medical and psychiatric industry, because under that paradigm, I think you already may know the conflict that Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung had. One was a spiritual argument, while the other was purely scientific one. And so for psychiatry as a field to evolve, they had to neglect spirituality for it to be a science. And if we are talking about the mind, we have to come from a spiritual place in order to have a observer's view of the mind. But instead of having that observer view, we are coming from the mind and trying to explain it. It's like a hand trying to grasp itself. It won't be able to. And so psychiatry has gone headfirst in this direction, and it's creating nonsense. And that's the problem. But you can't tell this to psychiatrists because their livelihoods depend on it. And so instead of taking a step back and saying, hey, maybe the research that we have done, DSM-5, when it was first created, had 106 disorders, I think. Now there's 290. So we keep inventing new psychiatric disorders. And, it's largely based on, we've created a drug. That drug works for this particular thing, but we don't have a disease to call that thing. So we'll just invent a disease and say, this is the disease that this drug works for. And, SSRIs, for example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are antidepressants, they were invented in the 1980s. And to date, the SSRIs have not changed. The research has changed, but we haven't come up with a different drug to target that. And partly that's the case is because it's funded by pharmaceuticals. And so the research is always coming up with a reason for why the drug needs to exist. Yeah. I find, so these are the challenges that I was seeing in the industry. And when I started voicing these things, of course, I got a very hard pushback. And so for me, being in the industry provided deep insights into how it worked. I was also funded by pharmaceuticals. And I sort of had a exit plan where I was constructing my own research, my own IP. And over time, I became recognized for my IP than the actual work I did for universities. And so that transition has taken years, but a lot of it has to do with the vagus nerve and what I call the cardiac pulmonary response. which is it's the first instance of perception of reality. So anything that happens around us, before it enters our mind, it will change our heart rate. And based on our heart rate, how we perceive what is happening around us changes. So, for example, if I changed the tone of this conversation and it became threatening, your heart rate will change, and most likely it will rise. And the conversation we are having will have a very different flavor to it. It'll go straight into the fight or flight mode. So we might be defensive, we might be aggressive, or we might want to do the flight response, which is like completely tune out. I'm not listening to you, you're not listening to me, and so those behaviors exist as one reality. And often what psychiatry focuses on is just that reality. They don't actually do research on the other half, which is when we are calm and relaxed and the parasympathetic state. There's no money to be made there, so there's no research there. And so my entire body of work is on this parasympathetic state, and what incredible abilities we gain from this state, because psychology won't provide you with that.
So is it essentially to try and summarize here and let me know if I misunderstand anything, most of modern psychiatry and psychology and even these antidepressants and medication, they're trying to treat the consequence of what is happening, which is people go into this fight or flight state, they've got like high heart rate, whereas actually what you're trying to do is bring them back to, as you said, the parasympathetic state versus and try to calm them versus more like mask the symptoms of what they have.
Absolutely. So instead of calming someone down and going, wow, like the parasympathetic state provides a natural state of homeostasis. When the body is in homeostasis, your brain naturally comes into a neurochemical balance. Instead of just doing that one simple act, we go, your brain is lacking serotonin. So we'll just throw in some drugs and bring your brain into balance. But the problem is the nervous system is out of balance. So it will always result in a chemical imbalance. And that doesn't make any sense. You've done nothing to correct the state of the nervous system. In the brain, there's 100 different neurotransmitters sort of bouncing around at any given moment. And you've overloaded on one. How does that interaction change with all the other 99 neurochemicals running around in the brain? Like, we don't ask those questions. We just go, we lack this chemical, and here's the solution. I will just inject this chemical. And this is the problem. Like, it's a very effective marketing campaign, but it's a very poor solution.
You mentioned the vagal nerve, was it, for the heart, that's linked to the heart?
The vagus nerve.
Vagus nerve, sorry. Yeah. So essentially that nerve, like you're saying, and it goes into, people talk about tonality, people's energy when they're speaking. So as you said, if someone's very threatening or raises their voice or is very angry, your heart rate's going to go up. And what you're saying, so that comes from the vagus nerve, that reaction?
So we gotta, if you're talking about the vagus nerve, we'll get into it. So the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve descending from the brainstem into the body. And it is the largest peripheral nerve system entering the body. And the dorsal side, which is the back, goes into the heart and lungs, and the ventral side goes into all the other organ systems, digestion, renal, immune, so on. And the idea here is that we already know that 80 to 85% of the signal traveling in the vagus nerve is going up into the brain. So it is the body that is informing the brain about our state. That is very important to remember. It's not the other way around. We call this the central nervous system, but actually this is in the way it works, the central nervous system. So the body is informing the brain. And so when we go into fear, when we go into fight or flight, the homeostasis of the body is disrupted. It has to divert energy from other organ systems. It has to shut down digestion. It has to divert energy from renal and adrenal function so that it goes into the body to provide energy. It changes our metabolic rate, our thyroid function, so on. So that is always meant to be a short and acute process. Danger presents itself. We go into a heightened state. We either fight against danger or evade it. And then once the danger is over, we come back down. So that's a short duration activity. What has happened in modern society is that when the alarm bells ring in the brain, the body stays in that state because people have not learned how to downregulate. And so if we talk about what's happening in the brain, your heart rate rises. The information goes into the base of your skull. It fires up the structure called the locus coeruleus, which sends a shockwave-like signal into your brain, and suddenly you're on high alert. Under normal circumstances, people who are able to regulate their nervous system, the shockwave will pass, as all shockwaves do. But under what we call generalized anxiety disorder, the shockwave remains at the forefront of the brain. So people can't stop thinking about, the problem, or the thoughts keep running in their head as if the threat is still there and they're unable to switch off. And when I talk about, I find myself very isolated from people. It's because this is the mentality that I'm always communicating with. Imagine, how many cups of coffee people have? How fast is their heart rate? How fast is their mind running? And then having me communicate to them, I really struggle with that. Personally, I've only had coffee once in my life, and I don't take any stimulants. I don't take anything that is not natural. So if you come from this very natural state, it will look very unusual to people who are running on a sort of very highly agitated and heightened state.
So with the let's just call it the fight or flight state to simplify it. So with that state, as you said earlier, medications not necessarily the best solution. I also saw you talk about, I think on your website there was something around, you don't need medication or talk therapy. So with what you've been studying and what you're teaching now as well, what are the best solutions for people? Like how can you combat this anxiety, depression in like more of a natural way?
So I just want to paraphrase here that depression and anxiety are genuine psychiatric conditions, and often the first thing you need to know is that once the neurochemical balance in your brain has changed to that, it's very difficult to shift it back, because that didn't happen suddenly. It happened over time. And it's like when you have a bicycle wheel, if you sort of rotate it, it's very easy to do when it's not spinning. But once you start spinning it, it's very hard to rotate it.
No.
And that is what happens in the brain. So when the brain is still, it's very agile, it's very adaptive, and you can go into a state of depression and grief, and give yourself that moment. And then over time, it will pass and you spring back from it. But if you get stuck there, then you're stuck in the past, and that is very difficult to transition from. And the same with anxiety. If your brain is constantly thinking about the future, and it has been for the last 3 months or 6 years, then that neurochemical composition is very difficult to shift. So I want to paraphrase that first, and then we can talk about how we go about this. So the first thing that I teach people is how to breathe, and they've done that all their life. But when you show people how, it's quite a profound experience. And I use something called vagal breathing, which is my own proprietary technique. And it's very simple. It's a reflex arc. So every time you inhale, the heart rate rises to saturate blood oxygen. Every time you exhale, the heart rate slows down to exchange carbon dioxide. This is not just in humans, it's across all mammals. So it's a reflex. And so simply by prolonging the exhale to at least twice as long as the inhale, you can naturally start slowing down your heart rate. So once I teach that to people, teach them how to use vagal breathing, then I start introducing ways to connect breath with the body. And the best way to do that is through movements and reflexes. And so they go through a tactical movement program where I introduce ways to inoculate stress into the body. So what that means is I progressively increase the amount of stress. And because they know the vagal breathing, they're able to calm down just as quickly. And over time, what happens is that you can increase the stress threshold from like very low to very high, and they wouldn't even know it because it's like, the classic example of a frog in water. If you boil it very slowly, it won't hop out, but if it jumps into boiling water, it'll immediately spring out. So when you introduce stress to the body gradually, someone who has anxiety or trauma, the moment the tiniest amount of stress appears, they emotionally, it's quite, they blow up. But if you teach them breathing and stress inoculation, what happens over time is that the same stress can be introduced, but because the stress tolerance is so high, it won't create a reaction. And so that's largely what I do, and I do it through breath and movement.
So with the very interesting there about like voluntarily like giving yourself stress and increasing that over time, and then obviously the breathing, the movement can help with that. How would that work? How would you voluntarily give yourself stress? How do you do that?
Oh, it's been there throughout our entire history. When we chased an animal across the savannah, that's a stressful thing, right? When we chopped wood, that's quite stressful. When we lift up log and carry it back home to make fire, that is also quite stressful on the body. We don't think it as stress because if you gotta realize that in these environments, the body perceives these activities as play. And so it's not seen as threatening. And so when you introduce all these stresses to the body, but you're relaxed and you're playful and you're agile and you're adaptive, the body simply just gains this capacity. And so you can think of it as your muscles getting stronger. And so that's a physical response. But what people don't see is the internal response of how what we call heart rate variability, how that is changing. So someone with very poor heart rate variability is someone who's depressed or someone who's anxious. So under depression, as I said, the neurochemical imbalance is very difficult to shift. So, for example, you take someone who's depressed to a party and everyone's, having a good time while they still stand in a dark corner going, the world sucks.
Yeah.
And you can't change it through environment because their heart rate isn't responding. They're not going into this excited state. While for someone who's anxious, their heart rate cannot come down to baseline. It's constantly up there. And so the mind is constantly ticking as well. And so both these extremes of poor heart rate variability. Someone who's healthy, someone who's adaptive, has very high heart rate variability, which means that their moment-to-moment responses changes very quickly. For example, I can be calm and relaxed, and in an instant be excitable and alive, and it's like I can switch between states seamlessly, and that is known as high heart rate variability. So this is sort of a background concept to assist with understanding these protocols. And so at a certain point, when someone goes through these programs, the state goes from a very reactive state, which is under anxious, very low stress threshold, something like a light emotional wound happens and it creates a very strong response, to someone who has very high heart rate variability. So then a parasympathetic state, a light wound happens, agitates them, the heart rate rises and then decelerates back down just as quickly. That is known as high heart rate variability. While someone with low heart rate variability, they'll be down here, something happens, they rise up very quickly, and then they just stay there for hours, days, weeks.
With the stress though, so is that, say you're doing it voluntarily? Obviously, you mentioned the examples from when we were hunter-gatherers, right? But like in the modern day, is it physical exercises you're doing to yourself, or like how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely, it's physical. So one of the ways we can do it is through very heavy weights. And if you can think of someone who's about to deadlift, and maybe they're at the elite level and they're about to break a world record, they're psyching themselves up because they're going to be lifting a very, very heavy weight. And so that's a lot of stress. Obviously, I don't push people to that level of stress, but using challenging weights is one example. I teach them what is primary, which is how to remain calm and relaxed. Once the nervous system learns it, not the mind. So if the mind learns it, it stays there as a concept, but it doesn't translate to the body knowing it how to do. So I don't teach the mind, I teach the body. So once the body learns how to be calm and relaxed under stress, then I introduce the next step. Okay, let's try it on lifting a weight that your nervous system will find threatening. And for most people, they won't even attempt that weight if they didn't have the breathing technique, because the nervous system would just go into shock. So because now they know how to regulate, their stress tolerance and the capacity for stress has heightened. And so the threshold is much higher. When they do attempt it, even if they don't lift the weight, what is most important is changes in their heart rate. Are they able to elevate the heart rate, and are they able to downregulate just as quickly? Those are the key metrics that I focus on. The movement itself could be anything. It does not matter. People get fixated on what's the exact movement you should be doing. It could be
Yeah.
anything. You could be lying on the floor and trying to roll onto your back. And to do that without using stress, force, or momentum, for a lot of people, it's impossible. So
No.
just something a baby does effortlessly for adult human being is near impossible to do, especially as we age. If you over 40, it gets more difficult to get off the floor. If you're over 50, you probably are not attempting it. You're probably staying on, sedentary services. If you're over 60, you're probably minimizing your time on the ground. So there's so many stress-inducing activities that are just absolutely basic. The movement doesn't matter. It's more the body's response to that.
With the heart rate variability, as you said, you're testing yourself against these stresses. With slowing down your heart, that would be breathing out more, and then to increase your heart rate, it would be to breathe in more. Is that right? Or
so the vagal breathing, all it does is slow down the heart rate. Your heart rate will still rise because you're adding more pressure on the body and the blood flow is increasing. But you got to think of it in this way. Say your baseline heart rate is 72 beats per minute. If you apply vagal breathing, stress will increase it to 80 beats per minute. If you don't have vagal breathing, your heart rate will rise dramatically and it'll be up to like 150 beats per minute. And you're getting heart palpitations and the nervous system is getting very agitated. So that's a different scenario. So you don't want to do these movements under stress. We want to do it under relaxation, which is very contradictory. And especially for athletes, they find it very confusing because all they've done is psych themselves up for activities. And to do the opposite feels wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, 100. Because I imagine there are other instances that aren't related to stress. Maybe if you're tired, you don't have lots of energy. And in those situations, can it be good actually to increase your heart rate? Maybe breathing in out more than you're breathing. Like, are there instances that have the reverse where you can actually want to get in that more fight or flight zone, more cortisol? Or...
Yeah, so I mean, breath has multiple utilities. For my purposes, I don't consider those possibilities because I'm training them for one purpose and one purpose alone, which is how to regulate your nervous system under duress. That's it. For someone, for example, doing Wim Hof techniques, I've been with Wim Hof, and he says that you should pretty much bring down your breathing to the point where it's like non-existent. You're breathing in through the nose and just completely like surrendered. And that's how you enter the ice bath. In what I'm teaching, that becomes pointless because we are using activity, we are using energy, we're using high metabolic rate to do things. So, and then you've got yoga, which is an entirely different ball game. They use pranayama, which is alternate nostril breathing. So the breath has multiple utilities, and people use it for their specific purposes. Obviously, a swimmer has a very different breathing technique. So what I'm doing is to maximize brain-body connection so that the body knows how to respond under duress.
One of the last topics I want to talk about was around talk therapy, because as we said earlier, you got on your website, you don't need talk therapy. This is a very interesting topic for me. I'm by no means a psychologist, but yeah, I'm more on the Jungian side than the Freudian side, like yourself. And I think it's interesting because in modern society, there's a big, therapy's almost become trendy in a way. And I do think for certain people, therapy works and it helps them, right? But I do also think, and I was actually speaking to a friend of mine the other day whose brother sadly passed away recently. He's a very young guy in his 30s. and everyone in his he's actually doing like a master's degree, so even though he's my age, he's 35, he's kind of back at university with a lot of, you know, people who are younger. Oh, you need to grieve, you need to go to therapy. And I think, yeah, talk therapy isn't something everyone needs. Everyone needs some form of therapy, and that could be things around breathing, meditation, or whatever it is. But I feel like nowadays it's a thing where a lot of people almost like forcing talk therapy on people, and that's not always the way. Sometimes people need different therapy, and I know that's one of the things, you know, Jung talks about as well, right? But anyway, it'd be good to get your to hear your thoughts about, you know, how you came to this conclusion that you don't necessarily need talk therapy.
Yeah, so obviously talking is therapeutic. Even in the most basic fundamental sense of when you're speaking, you're breathing out more, and according to vagal breathing, that will slow down your heart rate. So just in the most basic premise, talking is therapeutic. Don't get me wrong. The other thing is when you talk, you build a sense of connection with someone, and that sense of bonding is crucial. So what would happen in a tribal setting is you'd have elders that you would go to, and you'll share your problems with them, and there'll be wise men or wise women. They'll just listen to you, have you vent, and they might say maybe one or two words, and those two words are huge for you in that moment. It just blows your mind open. You're like, wow, like I didn't think of it that way. And then you run off going, wow, like that was amazing. What we've done is we've commercialized that. And in order to retain your client, you must shift that power dynamic so they're a victim who needs to keep coming back to you to share their thoughts. And that is not helpful. When an elder can do it in 2 words and it changes someone's life, why can't psychologists do it in 8 sessions? Or, you know, it's like we've stripped away people from a social structure, a tribe, a family, a group of friends. We've isolated people, and then we charge them money so that they can get the very basic benefits of just talking to someone. And I know I have clients as well. They come to me, we talk over Zoom. I take them through my programs, and they say, you're the only one I'm actually talking to this week. They have kids, they have work colleagues, they might have a husband or wife, they have friends, but they don't actually talk to each other.
No.
We've lost the art of talking. If you followed this conversation, you've realized that when we talk, we formulate an idea in our mind, and then we drive it to a logical conclusion. Once that conclusion is reached, there's space. Nothing is spoken until the next question is asked or the next suggestion is made. And that takes another thought form to its logical conclusion. In society, we don't give space for conversation. Everyone's talking on top of each other. And then we need talk therapy. How ironic. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. I love what you said around we're losing touch with, you know, our community, our families, and then we end up talking to a stranger who has commercialized therapy in a way so that we're the victim and we need to go back. And it's interesting because another, you know, a lot of the people that I was talking about earlier who are like, everyone's trying to force therapy on me. I have another friend whose ex-girlfriend sadly committed suicide, which was a terrible thing. And again, everyone was like, you got to go to therapy, you got to go to therapy. And one of the things he said is, I have a very close network of friends, and one of them I went to the pub with one day, and we had a really good conversation, and I was crying by the end of it. And he's someone I can tell anything to. And he said, look, you need to do this more, because going to the pub and having a conversation with your friends, that can be a form of therapy. And it's like you're saying, you don't need to go and sit with a stranger. Talking, as you said, is therapeutic, but it doesn't have to be in this formalized setting, which is, I think, how modern psychiatry and psychology has evolved, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it doesn't always go into talk therapy. Like CBT is one way, but some psychologists use EMDR and other forms of trauma release. Some of these techniques do work. The problem with these techniques is they are within the psychological framework. And as we talked about at the very beginning of this podcast, psychology by its very nature is flawed, because a hand cannot grasp itself. And that's what the mind trying to do with our minds. So that's why you don't get results with psychology. You might get mediocre results. So if you're depressed, you may be half happy, but you won't be fully vibrant and alive as a true human being. That's a different aspect that you need to work on, and that's the parasympathetic state, which psychology doesn't explore.
Yeah, I feel we could do a whole nother hour just on the topic of therapy. But yeah, I've really enjoyed today's show. I just wanted to give you the last, 30 seconds to a minute. Is that we were obviously going to put your book in the show notes, some of those articles I read. Is there anything else you wanted to promote here at the end of the show?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the book is one. It's called Hidden World, The Inside Story of the Soul. And that recollects all the journeys that I've been through to find an integrated understanding that I was talking about after my near-death experience. So I've, instead of sharing my own story, I've done it in folklore format. So it's very mythological, and I think people will enjoy reading that. And also I've got an online course. So all the breathing and movement exercises that I'm talking about are in that course. And it also has the vagal breathing technique. So my online course is on my website, drkaushikram.com. I also have a YouTube channel which provides all this information for free. So if you want to deep dive in one of these topics, you can find a video that talks about it. And yeah, I've got a TED Talk coming out very soon as well. So I did it last month, and it should be released any day now.
Awesome. And yeah, it was, I think, Andrew Lewis, who was the one that introduced us. He was at that TED Talk. So yeah, shout out to Andrew for introducing us, because I've really enjoyed this show, and I've learned a lot. So thanks a lot, Kaushik.
Absolute pleasure, Mike. And yeah, shout out to Andrew.
Absolutely love today's show with Dr. Kaushik. I learned a lot, some takeaways from my side. Interesting what he was talking around with the vagus nerve, which is obviously related to your heart, and the fact that often we're trying to, let's say, anxiety, depression, these things are often related to an increase in heart rate, like he was talking about, that fight or flight state. When we were back in the day, when we were hunter-gatherers, that was useful if we were trying to chase down an animal, right? Or if we were maybe running from a bear, as an example. But nowadays, we're often going into this fight or flight state when we don't need to, right? And that's coming from the heart. We think it's coming from the mind. We think we're talking ourselves into these situations. But actually, if we can look at it, as he said, from an outside perspective, this is where the spiritual play comes in. The mind can't solve the mind. But if we go from a spiritual place connected to the heart, how can we do this? Through breathing, the vagus nerve. So how can we slow down our heart rate? As he said, you don't necessarily need to go out and check out his courses. If you want to do that, of course, that's great. But just focus on breathing out for more than you breathe in. So you could do it right now. You could literally say, I'm going to breathe in 4 seconds. I'm going to breathe out 7 seconds. This is a technique I've done, and you will see it does help you lower your heart rate. I've done this myself actually before going to sleep, or sometimes I will wake up 2 or 3 in the morning at night, And I'll do the same thing. I'll try and breathe out more than I breathe in. And suddenly you get into more of a relaxed state. So that would be one of my biggest takeaways for you, is if you are in this fight or flight state, if you get into anxiety, right? We all have it. I'm not someone that's been depressed, but I certainly get anxious a lot, if not on a daily basis, through work, through various things. And I find this breathing technique is very helpful. So that's takeaway one. The second takeaway is what we were talking about at the end with talk therapy. Now, as Kaushik said, talking is important. Talking is naturally therapeutic. And you don't necessarily need to go to a therapist. And I know lots of people that have gone to talk therapy with a formal psychiatrist, psychologist, and it's been really useful and they've had a really good connection with that person and they can open up. But I also know for lots of people, it doesn't work. And you don't have to continuously go back and think, oh, this doesn't work for me. You can talk to other people in your life. Like I was talking about, you can talk to friends, you can talk to family. So just talking in itself is therapeutic. And as Kaushik was saying, it increases oxytocin and these things, the human connection. It's a natural part of what we need. But in itself, talking to people is useful. So you don't necessarily need to go to a formalized psychologist. So maybe if therapy is not working out for you in a formal sense, try it in an informal sense with some people that you know. So those would be my two main takeaways today. This is quite a unique episode we have. I would love to hear your comments. So if you're on YouTube, leave a comment. If you're on Apple or Spotify, maybe leave a review with your comments. And yeah, we'll see you next week for another episode. Cheers.